A coworker told me this about 3 years ago. She said that I could share it, but only so long as I promised to protect her identity and remove identifying details. I'll do that now by referring to her only as M. This is the story M told me, as best as I can tell it to you. There was an older man in M's neighborhood who seemed very pleasant, in the way that elderly strangers often are. M owned a dog and the old man owned one too. He asked M one day whether she'd like to start walking their dogs together. They arranged to meet at his house around noon the next day. M arrived at the agreed-upon time and knocked on the door. The old man answered and explained that he wasn't quite ready to leave yet. He invited her in to sit down for a few minutes while she waited for him. She agreed and stepped into the house. Her dog, a terrier puppy, followed her inside and began sniffing around the man's ankles. The man invited M to sit, gesturing at an upholstered chair in a sunny corner of the living room. At this point, there didn't seem anything wrong. M sat down. Her first clue that things were wrong was when the man plopped a heavy hardcover book into her lap.
"I'll be ready in just a few minutes,"
he said.
"That book is worth looking through until then."
He smiled and lowered himself onto the nearby couch to lace his shoes, grinning up at her while he did so. He was waiting for her to open the book, and so she humored him. M doesn't remember the exact title, but it was clearly a collection of graphically erotic poetry. M was around 28 years old when this happened, and the man who had now cornered her in the house with a tome of old erotica was at least in his 60s. The man plied her with questions about her favorite kind of poems, while he dawdled with his shoelaces. M says she began to feel like she was being stalked by a predatory animal. Finally, the man seemed satisfied by her guarded answers to his questions.
"I just need to leash up Buster,"
he said.
"and then we can go."
He left her alone in the room. M put the book aside. She was feeling uncomfortable and prepared to leave the house regardless of whether her neighbor was ready or not. That's when she heard a woman scream. The voice that cried out was plainly coming from the basement, and it sounded to M like someone downstairs was being murdered. She heard the word shouted with so much force, the woman's voice was breaking. M couldn't immediately process what was happening. It seemed too absurd. Her terrier puppy froze in place upon hearing the scream, and then ran to her so that she could scoop him up in her arms. She rose from the chair to run for the front door, but the old man was suddenly standing behind her. He owned a much larger dog, and the hound was now leashed and ready at his hip. It bristled as though it was now very, very nervous.
Don't worry,
the old man laughed, as though nothing strange at all had happened.
That's my...
He paused and snapped his fingers, though searching for a word.
What do you call it? Yes, that's my parrot. I keep a parrot in the basement. It just screams like that sometimes. He's my pet. That's all it was.
Begged the voice from the basement. The man's smile grew wider and more cloying.
Let's go down to the basement,
he said.
I'll show you. It's just my parrot down there.
The old man was using his own body to try and move M down the stairs. He held the door to the basement open while blocking the hallway that led back to the front of the house. His large dog was bristling just behind him. M had only two choices: She could either agree to go down the stairs, or she could flee with her own dog directly backwards into the living room. Em decided to flee backwards. She returned to the living room and started making excuses about why she needed to leave. The old man followed her into the living room, trying to calm her. She claimed that she was feeling sick and that her boyfriend would be expecting her back home soon. Em didn't really have a boyfriend waiting for her at home, but the old man's face deflated when she said that she did. Taking advantage of his hesitation, she was able to push past him and make for the front door of the house. The man didn't chase after her. He just protested angrily that she was being silly. Em threw the door open and let herself out. When she got home, she called the police and told them what she'd heard coming from the basement. They took her statement and said they'd look into it. Em saw the old man's car disappear from his driveway about 2 hours after she left his house. The police arrived later that evening to investigate, but the man hadn't returned. Curious about what happened, Em says she called a few days later to inquire whether the authorities found anything. "This is now an open investigation," they told her. "We can't give you those details."
Please, just tell me one thing.
Em insisted.
Was there a parrot in the basement? A birdcage? Anything like that?
The voice on the other end of the line grumbled before answering.